Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of multimedia journalism. Dr. Shermack here. Hopefully, everyone's doing well and had a good first week 1 as we started to introduce ourselves to the class and class concepts. This week, we're going to dive in even a little bit deeper and really get into talking about what is multimedia journalism. So, let's take a look at what's on the show for today as you tune in. I do want to follow up on something that I mentioned during our first week video lecture, and that is further explanation of news values. News values are really important because they help us decide what is news and help us decide what we cover. And a lot of times, sometimes, let me try that again. Sometimes um, the the news values can get a little lost because we're trying too hard to make something multimedia. I'm going to explain that a little bit more as we move forward today. We have to remember that at its core, any multimedia journalism that we do is journalism. So it should tell a story. And we want to keep that in mind anytime we're doing any type of journalism, whether it's more traditional written journalism or more advanced multimedia journalism, as we do in this class. So we're going to talk about news values, and then we're going to take a look at how those news values are specifically applied to multimedia journalism. Once we do that, we'll wrap up, we'll take a look ahead, and I'll talk a little bit about what you're going to be doing here in week 2. So let's dive right in. This will probably look a little bit familiar to you because we talked about it during week 1 video lecture. And this is something that I also discuss in my news writing class. So if you have taken that class or you're in that class, you'll be hearing about these a lot more. They're foundational parts of journalism, and that's why we discuss them in not only this class, but also other classes, and something that we'll continue to come back to as we talk through story ideas going forward. So elements of news value. The question that all of these together answer really is, how newsy is this? Or to use a word that's an actual word, but not newsy, but how newsworthy is this? What makes this news? So something that makes any kind of event or story news is timeliness. How recent is it? Usually when we report the news, no matter what kind of journalism we're doing, traditional or multimedia, we're talking about something that's fairly recent. And the more recent it is, the higher the news value of timeliness is. So that's timeliness. Conflict. Is there disagreement? Is there some kind of clash? When we say conflict and disagreement, I think we think a lot about people arguing, but it can be any kind of what I call versus situation. So is it man versus nature, right? Any kind of like weather disaster, for example, that's an example of conflict that has a high news value. Is it politicians disagreeing? Of course, there's news value there too. Is it a car accident, man versus machine, let's say? That's conflict. So you have to get a little more creative sometimes with your definition of conflict, because you can see that it's all around us. And again, the more conflict there is, the more likely that is to have a higher news value. Novelty, you see the little spaceship there. Novelty asks, is this a unique event? Is this something that is strange, out of the ordinary, doesn't happen very often? That will increase the news value for a given story, something that's kind of funky and strange. And it could be novelty. I kind of call it sometimes fun novelty versus not so fun novelty. So fun novelty is like, a water skiing squirrel. You ever seen the news stories about when they have a squirrel that knows how to water ski? Maybe not, but that's kind of the traditional sort of news joke when we talk about novelty. Or if I think about the movie Anchorman, I think Veronica Corningstone had to cover a cat fashion show, if I'm remembering right. That was novelty. It was kind of funky, kind of weird. So that's the fun side of novelty. There's a not so fun side of novelty too. One example I can think about, COVID-19. Do you remember early on in COVID-19, they were calling it a novel coronavirus? This is the same definition that we have with novelty, in that it was new, it was different, it was something we hadn't seen before. Um, Terrible events like plane crashes or shootings, and people will argue that we see shootings a lot. but they still have a lot of this bad novelty to them. It's not what we expect. We don't expect to have a plane crash when we get on board. We don't expect to be involved in a shooting when we go to school. Those have a great deal of novelty, and that increases their news value. Impact. How much does the story affect the audience? How much does the story affect the audience? So if it's there's a reason why power outages are a huge story, because they affect a lot of the audience. There's a reason why major weather events have a huge impact, that have a huge news value, because they make a major impact on the audience. So impact, how much does the story affect the audience? If it just affects maybe one or two people, it may not have the highest impact value. Prominence. Does the story involve someone of note? So does the story involve someone important? I think I mentioned this during the first lecture, but the reason we have celebrity news is because prominence is a news value. If celebrities get divorced, if celebrities get married, if celebrities start dating, that becomes news because they're prominent people. If I go out and do that, that's not news, other maybe than to me and my family and friends, right? So prominence is because prominence has to do with how well do we know this person, how well known are they, what kind of power do they have, so on and so forth. The last one we'll talk about is proximity. Is the story nearby? And what we have to think about here is the story nearby the news outlet, not necessarily the reader. So for example, if there's an earthquake in San Francisco, the proximity is going to be very high for a newspaper like the San Francisco Chronicle, or a TV station up there, for example. It's maybe even going to have a relatively high proximity for the Slow Tribune or KSBY. But the proximity news value isn't going to be very high for a newspaper in, Idaho, or a newspaper in Iowa. It doesn't mean it won't be a news story there, but the proximity won't be as high there because it's further away from the news outlet. Okay. So it's not necessarily where the person is located, it's where the news outlet is located, and the coverage, the geographical coverage area for that news outlet. So one thing I want to point out, and then we're going to look at some examples to illustrate this a little bit more thoroughly, is that you don't have to have all the news values in every one of the stories you analyze, okay? You don't have to have all the news values present. Some of these can register as 0 and still be a news story, all right? Most stories have one of these probably registering at a 0. For example, not every story involves someone of prominence, right? Most of the time they involve some kind of timeliness and some kind of proximity. Those are the most common news values present in news stories. Let's look at some examples I think that might clarify this a little bit further. So I have a story here. This is a story from a high school in Georgia. Appalachia High School shooting suspect is charged with 4 counts of murder. All right, so yes, a very serious story. This is from NPR, National Public Radio. So this is a national news source. I pulled this story on the same day that it was published. So this is very new news. So the timeliness of this is really high. All right, this story was published the day after this shooting, and the story is announcing the charges against the suspect. So it's a very, very timely story. It's brand new. In terms of conflict, we also register very high with conflict because there's a shooting here. There's a murder that's taken place. 4 people were shot and killed. 2 students, 2 faculty members were killed. So you have a very high degree of conflict here. Novelty. I would say novelty is also very high here. And people will roll their eyes when I say that, because they'll say, well, it seems like there's a school shooting every week. And it does seem that way. But it still is unusual for shootings to take place in school. Let me repeat that. It is still unusual for shootings to take place in school. Millions of people go to school every single day. And it's not like this happens every day. This is still a very novel, unique event. Okay. Impact. This is an interesting one. This is where you have to pay attention to the news source. So this is National Public Radio. It covers a national audience. So the impact here isn't going to be as high with the audience as it would if you have a newspaper, say, from the town where the school is located. If there's a newspaper in this town where the shooting took place, and I don't know if there is or not, but let's say there is, it's going to remain very high on impact for a long time because it did impact so many people in that community. As a percentage, if we look at NPR and think of NPR's audience as a national audience, this didn't really impact a high degree of people in the audience. And when I say impact, I mean prevent them from going to school, or maybe there's family members who were victims or family members that were affected. I'm not saying it didn't make an impact on people. People were sad, people worried. It certainly made that impact. I'm talking about a more disruptive impact. So the impact here, because it's NPR, it's not necessarily 0, but it's also not a 10. It's somewhere, I would say, in a mid-range, like a 5. If this were the local newspaper, it would definitely be a 10. Okay, so it's relative to the news outlet when we start talking about news values. Prominence. Let's think about prominence. Did this involve anyone of note? Not really. I would say prominence probably measures a 0 here. And it doesn't mean that the people who were affected by this, and certainly the people who were killed, don't mean anything. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying it didn't involve, a head of state or someone who is well known as a celebrity. It measured a 0 here on prominence. And again, that's okay. It doesn't mean it's not news. Then you have proximity. Proximity here, and again, this relates back to where is the news source covering? What is the news source covering? What's the geographical area the news source is covering? NPR is a national outlet, so it's covering the entire United States. So this is proximate in that it happened in the United States. But again, just sort of like the same thing with the impact, it would be higher if it were the local newspaper, right? It'd be higher if it was the local newspaper. So that's just kind of walking through step by step. So notice we had some categories of news values that were like 10s out of 10s. We had a couple that were 0. We had a couple mid-range. But this is still a really important news story because there's a lot of news value associated with it. Here's a story from a couple years, or not a couple years ago, I guess. Yeah. Indian government asked people to hug cows on Valentine's Day. Indian government asked people to hug cows on Valentine's Day. In Indian culture, the cow is viewed as a sacred animal. And this was some kind of promotion related to that from the Indian government. This is kind of a silly story, right? It certainly is a lot lighter than the story we just saw about the school shooting. And I'm sorry if that was such a jarring juxtapose. So let's walk through the news values. Let's take a look at timeliness. We're talking about Valentine's Day, which is every year on February 14th. This story was published on February 9th, ahead of Valentine's Day. So I would say, yeah, this story is very timely. It's probably like a 10 out of 10 as far as timely goes. Is there conflict here? I don't know. I don't think people are protesting hugging cows on Valentine's Day. Hugging a cow certainly wouldn't strike me as a way of hurting the animal. I would say there's very little conflict involved in this story. I would probably put it at a 0. It's hard for me to think of what would be a conflict related to hugging cows on Valentine's Day. Novelty? Novelty. If you thought 10 out of 10 on novelty, you are correct. All right. This is a very novel story. It's kind of silly thinking about hugging a cow, right? It's something weird. It's something kind of goofy. This is a 10 out of 10 when it comes to novelty. Impact on the audience. First thing we want to do is check what is the source. You can see up there in the left-hand corner, it's AP. If you don't know, Associated Press is the source. The Associated Press is an international news organization. So they cover the entire world. All right. This is taking place in India. So India, sure, is a large country, but it's not impacting the entire world, even though it could be impacting a lot of people because India does have a major population. So I would say here, the impact is relatively low. Let's call it maybe a 3. It's nothing that's crazy high or anything like that. Next, you have prominence. Prominence. So this is involving cows in India. It's involving the Indian government. It's involving Valentine's Day. We're thinking mostly about people. Valentine's Day has some kind of prominence because people know about it. So I'd maybe give it a little bit of prominence there. Maybe there's a well-known Indian government official in the story. So maybe there's a little prominence there. So I'd probably go with about a 3 here, once again. And then let's go to proximity. Proximity, again, check what is the source of this story. It's the Associated Press. The Associated Press covers the world. This is about one country in the world. So it doesn't really have the highest proximity. So notice that we were relatively low in 4 of these 6 news value categories. Conflict pretty much 0, impact fairly low, prominence low, and proximity low. But the timeliness and the novelty were both 10s. So this is a really good example to show you that it can still be news without registering really high on every news value. This one registered very high on novelty and timeliness, and that made it a news story. Is it a breaking news story that's going to lead the news? Is it a story that's going to be on the front page of a newspaper? Probably not. And that's because it really doesn't have high values across the board for news values. But it's still news, albeit a little bit silly. Let's look at one more example. Here's a local story. Why doesn't SLO have drive-throughs? The other night I was on campus and I was working kind of late and I was hungry and I knew I didn't want to go home and cook anything, probably because I didn't have anything in the house to cook. And I thought, man, I just want to shoot through a drive-through. And I know that there's a Taco Bell on the way from my house in SLO to campus. And I know that there's a Jack in the Box. But I started thinking about it and I thought, I don't think either one of those places have a drive-through. So I was doing a little bit of Googling, went down a rabbit hole, and realized that SLO does not allow drive-throughs. And it's been this way for about 40 years. And there's a great debate about this. Some people hate it. Some people think it's great. About 40 years ago, SLO banned drive-throughs because they wanted people to get out of their cars and interact face-to-face inside of a store. They didn't want cars to sit and idle in line because it would hurt the environment. There's a number of reasons cited in this article. So this article is a certain type of article called an explainer. It's an explainer, all right? And it's a really important type of article because it answers a question that I had, and the question's even right in the headline. Here's the reason behind the ban, okay? So let's look at the news value for this story about the anti-drive-through city of SLO. So timeliness. I just mentioned this. This ban went into effect 40 years ago. There's no timeliness here. Now, maybe something comes up in the recent news that makes this a story again, but this could have just been like, hey, we should do a story about that. Someone was thinking about it in the newsroom or asking about it in the newsroom. We should do a story about that. There really isn't any timeliness here. So our clock, I would say it registers about a 0. Conflict. I think conflict here is pretty high, 10, right? And what gives it away is what comes after that long dash in the headline and what residents think. You're going to have residents in this story who very strongly disagree with this ban. And you're going to have residents in this story who very much agree with it. They disagree and agree. There's conflict there. I would say conflict in this story is pretty high, maybe an 8, maybe a 9. It's not a life or death sort of thing, but there's definitely conflict. There's definitely multiple sides here. Novelty. Novelty. Is this kind of weird? Yes. Yes, this is kind of weird. All right. This is news of the ordinary. In fact, I know it's really small, but if you look above the headline, and this story is from the Tribune, there's a little header up there that says weird. It just says weird. This is a weird story. So I think novelty is pretty high here. Impact. What about impact? What do you think about impact? I think impact is high. SLO is a large city. This is the San Luis Obispo Tribune. It impacts a lot of the audience. It's a pretty high impact. Now, some people might say, well, I don't get fast food anyway, or I don't do drive-thrus. I don't even own a car. Sure, you're not going to appeal to every member of the audience. That's fine. But this does impact a large swath of the audience. So I would say that the impact here is pretty high as well. Prominence. Does this involve anyone famous? Does this involve anyone of note? In the story, there's a couple city council folks that are quoted, but by and large, it's not super high with prominence, maybe a 3 or so. Proximity. The story is about SLO not having drive-thrus, and it's in the SLO newspaper. Very high proximity. This is happening right in the backyard of this newspaper's audience. So if we go back through to recap, timeliness 0, conflict 10, novelty 10, impact 10, prominence about a 3, proximity about a 10. At first glance, you might think, who writes about this? Who cares about this? Who's reading this story? When you run it through news values, you start to realize, wow, this really does have a high degree of news value. So understand, I think the big takeaway from news values is understanding the fact that sometimes we look at stories in the news, or maybe if we're in a newsroom, we brainstorm a story and think that's not news, who cares? And it takes an analysis of the news values to realize pretty quickly that a lot of people may care because it's high conflict, or because it's high novelty, or because it's high impact. So you have to go through and think critically about what you're going to cover and what you're reading about in the news in order to see that it does end up having a rather high news value. Okay. I want to show you another example of news value. This is I did some work with some research partners when I was finishing my PhD at the University of Texas. This is the heading of the online version of the Austin American Statesman. The Statesman is their local newspaper. And I want to show you, all we need to do is look at the headings and the organization of the page to see how it was shaped by news values. So you see on this page, we have, oops, hit the wrong button, hang on. We have weather. We have weather. If you think about weather and you put that up against through our news values machines, it's going to be very timely. Sometimes it's going to involve conflict when there's bad weather. And in Texas, you know, we used to get all the heat. We used to get the severe thunderstorms. Sometimes we get hurricane remnants. There's a lot of conflict. And with those interesting events, there came novelty, right? Weather events can be very novel if they're kind of strange. I also remember one time it got below 30 degrees in Texas and everyone lost their damn full mind. Impact, yes, weather impacts. You can make an argument that weather impacts people more than any other kind of news story, right? It makes us change our plans sometimes. Sometimes it makes us make plans because it's going to be so nice outside. It alters what we wear, right? It alters what we do. It alters how much we hydrate, so on and so forth. Big, big impact. It doesn't really involve anyone of prominence most of the time. And then really high on the proximity. Look, you can even see a zip code, 78702. This is very, very high proximity because it's getting it right down into your zip code. So weather in our 6 news value categories in 5 of the 6, it's a 10. So weather goes right at the top of the page of the homepage. It's a big deal. You can probably guess where I'm going to go next. Traffic, right? Traffic is a big deal. Is it timely? Yes. It's up to the minute. Is there conflict? Of course there's conflict. You're stuck in traffic. It's not the way it's supposed to be. I'm supposed to get in my car and go from point A to point B as quickly as possible. Then I get stuck in traffic. That's a conflict. You can even see on this header here, they have something here called incidents. This means accidents or other things that are abnormal on your route, a pothole, a car pulled over to the side of the street. Novelty, sometimes there's novelty in traffic, and sometimes that leads to bad things, right? There's novelty in traffic, sometimes unique happenings. Impact, very high impact, right? This literally changes your movement. It slows you down. Very high impact. Prominence, not too high. And proximity, very high. There's a map right there. You can zoom in on wherever you're at. And this is, it says Austin. This is Austin's newspaper. Very high with proximity. So just like weather, in all of these instances, and I should say in 5 of the 6 news values, I think we're a 10 out of 10. Traffic is major news. That's why there's segments dedicated to them on most newscasts in most reasonably sized cities dedicated to traffic. They're major news events. Let's move along here. Things to do. Things to do. So this is going to tell you about a concert that's coming to the city, or maybe a charity event of some kind. Very timely. Not a lot of conflict. I don't know. Maybe there's some kind of debate or something. I wouldn't say it's too high as far as conflict goes. Novelty, it could be a novel event, I suppose, but not too high there either. Impact, sure. Things to do. This means things for you to do. High impact on the audience. Prominence, maybe someone famous is coming to town for a concert or a theatrical show. And proximity, look, it says by location. How close is it to our audience? We can help our audience find out right away. There's a header here that says new right now, and then underneath that new right now are going to be the latest headlines. This speaks directly to timeliness. You can click right here on this new right now and figure out what's the latest thing going on in Austin. News values have shaped the way they have laid out their homepage. And this really brings us to a multimedia example, right? This is a visual entity here. This is a visual media that is being conveyed to us. And it is organized, whether they did it consciously or not, it is organized by news value. All these things that have a very high news value, they have elevated to the top. Weather, traffic, things to do, news right now, shaped by their news value. So news values can not only dictate what we choose to cover, news values can also help us decide how to arrange our multimedia. Really interesting. I hope you think so too. The title of this week's module is What is Multimedia Journalism? We are easing into our multimedia journalism. And I thought it was a good time to fuse our definition of multimedia journalism with our news values, because those news values, as I hope I've just demonstrated, are so central to any journalism that we do. So what is multimedia journalism? I think it's important to have a good working definition of it as we dive in. So let's use this one, okay? And this has kind of just been created from an amalgamation of a number of different sources that I've used over the years. I'm just going to read it to you. Read along with me. Multimedia journalism refers to the integration of various media forms, such as text, images, audio, video, and interactive elements to tell a news story. It leverages digital technologies and platforms to enhance storytelling and audience engagement. There's a lot going on there. I put in bold the words that I think are most powerful. Obviously, multimedia journalism, because that's what we're defining, but integration. it's really a mixture of these elements. And most of the time, in most good multimedia journalism, there is going to be text involved. That's why we still talk about writing in this multimedia journalism class. We'll do that in the towards the midway to back half point of the semester. We still talk about writing because text is still involved in multimedia. If you do a photo gallery, you're going to have captions that go with that. If you do a video, you're probably going to have a caption that goes with it, or sometimes the text right on the image or right on the video. If you have audio, usually that audio is going to be written maybe as some sort of script. Let's say if you're doing a podcast. Interactive elements will also be very text heavy. So text goes along with almost all of these different elements. But we're going to look at all these in class: images, audio, and video. We're going to look at some interactive examples. I posted some in week 1. I'm also going to show you some here in just a moment of interactive elements. And it's all about telling a story, being a storyteller. And what we're hoping to do is to produce audience engagement, where they're clicking through and looking at images, where they're clicking and listening to audio, where they're sharing video, where they're actually interacting with these interactive elements that we're creating. That's what we want to do. We want to create more audience engagement than someone just scanning a story and reading a story. We want to make them feel involved. That's multimedia journalism. That's doing multimedia journalism at the highest level. Let's bring back in our news values and look at some examples of multimedia journalism. So one of the ways when we have a high impact event, and we talk about impact in relation to the news outlet, but I think that it's really safe to say that any of the wars that are taking place in our world, anytime a war takes place in our world, that has a high impact on a lot of people. I'm using an example here from the war in Ukraine. The New York Times has put together what they're calling a photographic chronicle of the second year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this is a photo gallery. When I talk about slideshows or photo galleries in class, that's what I'm talking about. And this is an example. I will tell you that I was going to put more images in here, but some of the images are really difficult to look at. Some of the images are really pretty graphic. And I think they're done in a tasteful way, but they're painful. And it's a little difficult to convey that and have that on a slideshow, or I'm sorry, a video lecture. So I didn't put the images in here. But if you go into the slides that are on Canvas, you can click through and go look at these images yourself. Just be warned that there are some graphic images. But what visuals can do, be it a photo or a video, visuals can really emphasize the impact news value. They can show you people who have been unfortunately brutalized by acts of war or acts of terror. And so if we want to emphasize impact, we can do that very effectively in multimedia journalism by using visuals like photos and video. And this happens all the time. If there is a large scale event, such as a natural disaster, a lot of times news outlets will have photo and or video galleries showing the impact of that event on the people and on the area. As you can see in this images, you have destroyed what looked to be homes where people lived, streets that people used. Those look destroyed as well. And you have some kind of fire burning in the foreground there of that photo. So looking at just this single image, we can tell, I don't have to, it's easy to see, was this war a high impact event? Does this war have a high impact rating as far as news values? The picture is the proof, right? The picture is the proof. So we can really build a lot through visuals with impact. Another example is interaction, creating an interactive tool. And I want to show you this one, and bear with me here. I'm clicking through sort of, I know I'm not live because I'm recording this, but I'm clicking through in real time to show you this. This is a tool from, and I want to also just be transparent in that this is not a news organization. This is the um, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. Um, and they have a tool here for us to visualize sea level rise. But a newspaper or another, not even a newspaper, a news outlet can and has produced things like this to demonstrate certain phenomenon in our world. And what this tool does, and I'm hoping it'll load, what this tool does is it allows you to input your own zip code or zoom into your own area and then see how sea level is going to affect your area. It doesn't look like it's working for me right now, but that's okay. And I'm going to say it's okay because if you go into our slides, the PDF version of our slides on Canvas, this will be working in there. So if you want to go in and punch in any zip code, you're going to be able to play with that and see if see how sea level rise will alter those areas that you choose. So this is a really powerful example. I know it's more powerful if it works, forgive me. You get a little bit of an idea here in this screenshot. I zoomed in on Morro Bay here. And if you see, okay, if the sea level rises 7 more feet than it already is, you're going to see parts of Morro Bay covered in water over the next however many years it would take for the sea level to rise. When you have users going in and inputting their local zip codes and, you know, adjusting sliders and zoom functions in and out, that's interaction. That's powerful interaction. And that really emphasizes the proximity news value because they're going right to where they live and looking at exactly how a news story, and sea level rise is a news story, looking exactly at how that impacts their area. So tools like this from NOAA have been developed by news outlets all the time, and they do a really nice job of emphasizing proximity through interaction. Let's look at another example and let's hope it works. An emphasis on timeliness through audience engagement. This is a really cool one, and I think they did one for the most recent eclipse as well, but I'm going back to 2017 just because I remembered how cool this was. The New York Times, I'm sorry, the Washington Post, I misspoke. The Washington Post took to Instagram during the 2017 eclipse. And you can see it here. It says, we took more than 44,000 geolocated Instagram photos uploaded with the Eclipse 2017 hashtag during the eclipse's route over the United States, and grouped them by latitude and longitude. Below, you can see the most popular or liked image per area. So let me recap that. They went on, they looked for the hashtag Eclipse 2017. They gathered 44,000 images from across the country. They geotagged them, so they put them right at their latitude and longitude, and they created this map. And then they basically put on this map the most popular, the most liked photos from that group. And so what's cool is you can go in here, and when you hover over, this is my, let me go back and do it again. You hover over my home state of Michigan, you can see some of the photos pop up that were part of this group. Okay, we go out here to California. Down more in our area, there's Lompoc. What do we have here? Bakersfield. And there's Castoro Cellars Winery. I believe that's very close by, if not a little north maybe. But it's this really cool interactive map. So notice what I'm doing. It's emphasizing timeliness in the sense that it's looking at, it's looking at these photos from a particular moment. This stripe across the country is the path of the eclipse. Um, so it's emphasizing the timeliness of a given moment, a shared experience, and then it's using crowdsourcing and news gathering from social media to create this really cool multimedia journalism map that's interactive. So think about the news values at play here. There's timeliness because it's a moment in time that we're capturing. There's novelty because it's an eclipse and we know that's rather rare for that to happen. It's impact because the eclipse had a high impact on a lot of people. And it was this shared experience. It's proximity because we're clicking into specific areas across the country, maybe areas where we've lived or we've worked or we've visited or where we have people we know who live there. There's so much happening here, and it has such a high news value that it makes it a very intriguing, interactive piece of journalism. So again, if you want to play around with this a little more, the link is in the PDF that I have posted to Canvas. Feel free to take a look at it. It's kind of a fun thing to check out. That's from the Washington Post. So something to think about as we move forward, and you know, you should always be mindful of these news values and be asking yourself, as I create this multimedia journalism, what news values am I going to highlight? And we've seen some ways that you can do that, using images to highlight impact, using timeliness, using geolocators to highlight proximity, using hashtags and timestamps to highlight timeliness, using using interaction to highlight proximity. There's a lot of challenges and considerations when you put together multimedia. One of those is resource allocation. And this is simply, does a newsroom have enough bodies and have enough equipment to produce this sort of thing? That can be a challenge. All right, that's something to keep in mind. But there's so many great free tools, and we're going to use a lot of them in this class. There's so much that you can do with your own smartphones. Again, this class is geared towards that. Resource allocation is getting, I think, a little bit easier as we move forward. That said, always consider newsrooms are sometimes working with limited resources, so you should be mindful of that. You also want to keep in mind audience expectations. If things are a little bit too flashy, if they move a little too quickly, you could lose an audience member. You could lose someone because they may not have the technical capability or abilities to utilize that tool. So be mindful of that. And then, of course, there's technological constraints. I had some during this presentation, all right, where the sea level map didn't load. Sometimes that's the case, and it could be for a whole host of reasons. But sometimes people may not have, for instance, an internet speed that can keep up with an interactive multimedia tool that's been created. So be mindful of those as you create multimedia. There's some future trends in multimedia that I'm really excited about, some emerging technologies. I think that augmented reality and virtual reality is going to become something that we do a lot with in journalism. Creating virtual spaces where we can interact with a story in a way that we've never done before. There's already some of that work out there, but I think this is where we're trending. Drone journalism is a hot topic now. I've been to a number of different conferences where people are presenting on drone journalism. Not only what kinds of stories can you do with a drone, but what are the ethics involved, right? Because there's, some privacy concerns. There's even some safety concerns involved with drone journalism. So that's an emerging field as well. I think we're going to see a lot of outlets pivot towards even more interactivity, where people are truly clicking and sharing and circling and highlighting and doing things inside news stories. So multimedia journalism is in a really exciting moment. This class is kind of touching on the surface of multimedia journalism, and I hope it's piquing your interest in pursuing this further as you move on in your studies. And let's say you were to transfer to a four-year institution, you would start taking classes that only focus on audio or only focus on maybe on AR and VR. or only focus on drone journalism. So you do a deeper dive in classes as you move forward throughout your undergraduate studies, and then even into your graduate studies if you choose. All right, we're going to take a look ahead. I just think the big takeaways here are thinking about, number one, what is multimedia journalism? It's an integration of text, video, audio, photos, interaction that is used to tell a story in a unique way. And then the news values that we have in play, the timeliness, the conflict, the impact, the novelty, the prominence, and the proximity. How do those play in, and how do those shape our multimedia news pieces that we will create? So be thinking about those. Be thinking about those as we do our work for this week. First task, read the Adornato chapter 2, Navigating Change, the Mobile First Newsroom. He does a wonderful job looking at the reasons why we're pushing not only multimedia newsrooms, but mobile newsrooms. And it looks at it from the journalist perspective as well as the audience perspective. I think chapter 2 is one of the best chapters in this entire book. So make sure you read that. It's very good. We'll have our week 2 quiz. That quiz will be over chapter 2. It'll also be over this video lecture, and it'll include a couple questions about current events in the news. And then last but not least, we'll have a discussion board that goes a little bit beyond what we did in week 1, actually a lot more beyond what we did on week 1, called Multimedia Example. And it's a very obvious name because I'm asking you to find an example of multimedia journalism. It could be similar to what we just saw here in the lecture or completely different. But I'm asking you to bring that into the discussion and do some analysis of it. You'll also be asked to reply to at least one of your peers in the discussion to add some input and analysis about their example. And by the end of week 2, we're going to have this really nice sort of library of multimedia journalism examples. So I'm really excited for what you can find and bring in. Please read the instructions carefully. If you have any questions at any time, as always, please let me know. Have a wonderful week 2, and I will see you in Canvas. Thanks, everyone. Take care.